have very deep specific knowledge about some of these topics. For some of you, these topics will be brand new. Please know that I am going to touch on each one of these four, but of course there is much, much, much more to be said about each one of them. We're going to have questions in the chat just because we want to make sure that I can cover all of the material so that everybody who needs this material has an opportunity to hear the pieces that they need. So if you have a question, please feel free to put it in the chat. If we don't get to it right now during the presentation, you are always, always welcome to call or email us. I am always happy to answer questions that way as well. So here's our roadmap for this webinar. We're going to start by talking about what is dyslexia. There are many misconceptions about what it is. We're going to talk about what happens once you have decided that the child before you may have dyslexia when you move to the evaluation process. What should you be looking for in those evaluation reports? Once you have those evaluations in hand, when you are looking to the school district to advocate for dyslexia services, what is some of the language that you should be using? And also, what does the law actually say about dyslexia? And at the very end, we're going to talk about Orton Gillingham. What is it? How does it work? And also, what is it not? So let's start right in. What is dyslexia? I'd like to cover really three different definitions of dyslexia, or rather two definitions before we get to the legal definition, just so we have a full and complete picture of what dyslexia is. So let's begin with the teaching definition. The Academy of Orton Gillingham Practitioners and Educators, now known as the Orton Gillingham Academy. They are very much the gold standard for traditional Orton Gillingham. This is their definition of dyslexia. So individuals with dyslexia are those who, despite traditional classroom teaching, have failed to master the basic elements of their language system. And since language is the necessary tool that subsequent academic learning is based on, these individuals often later encounter difficulty in all their educational endeavors. So in other words, these are individuals who have been introduced to reading through traditional schooling and yet have failed to master those basic elements of language. And as a result, they may have difficulty throughout their academic career. So this is what I call the teaching definition of dyslexia. Let's move on into the science definition. Why is this happening? If that is the definition of students with dyslexia, what's happening that's causing that? There is a very, very, very large body of research on dyslexia, including right up until 2024. I'm looking at 1998 right now because the Shaywitzes, it's a husband and wife team, Sally and Bennett Shaywitz, they were some of the first people, and they're based out of Yale, they were some of the first researchers to really look into using an MRI machine or an fMRI machine to look at activity in the brain during different reading or pseudo-reading tasks. This is 1998, so the language that they're using, non-impaired for individuals without dyslexia and dyslexic, this is language from 1998. And I'm going to only touch very superficially on what you're seeing on the screen. But this is a figure, this is an illustration from a paper that they wrote on their study of adults with dyslexia. And if you look right in the middle there, what we're looking at is the brain of somebody facing that direction. And what they discovered was those without dyslexia on many tasks were using this part of the brain, the posterior, the back part of the brain, back here. But when they looked at the brains of individuals with dyslexia doing the same tasks, they saw a lot of activation in a different part of the brain. And this suggested to them that there is a neurological basis or a neurobiological basis for dyslexia. The brain is doing something different in the brains of those individuals with dyslexia. And they moved on to look at children. So that study was in adults, and they moved on to look at children, and they did something similar. to show that the brains of children without dyslexia, when compared to the brains of children with dyslexia while doing reading tasks, as you can see, there's a difference there. There's a difference in how the brains are processing reading and reading tasks. In particular, they discovered that there were some differences in particular in the back of the brain. There is, of course, much, much more to that story and much more in-depth research to be talked about. But for our purposes, the takeaway is there are brain processing differences between those who have dyslexia and those who do not. And that's going to become actually important as we talk about the process of looking into services for children with dyslexia. Now we're going to move into the legal definition of dyslexia, because when you walk into an IEP meeting, you are in the world of the law. That is a legal process. So we're going to look at what the legal definition is of dyslexia. If I asked you to walk into a law library and find me all of the books that pertain to educating students with disabilities, you would really have to go to 3 different shelves: the federal shelf, the state shelf, and the local shelf. For our purposes right now, we're going to focus on federal law. These are the big laws: the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. We are usually referring to a little piece of it known as Section 504. You'll see Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, is kind of grayed out down there. In our K through 12 context, it doesn't come in very much. I just want it in the back of your mind because sometimes we refer to it. So we're going to look at the IDEA and Section 504 and find out what is the federal definition of dyslexia, since these are the big laws that we use for children with disabilities. But we have a little problem. Federal law actually doesn't give a definition of dyslexia. Let's look at that. So let's start with Section 504 and see what it does say about children with reading difficulties. So Section 504 defines an individual with a disability as a person with a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. And reading is a major life activity under the law. And that's where the law stops. In terms of defining dyslexia, it is not there. So reading is covered, individuals with reading difficulties are covered, but there is no definition of dyslexia here. So let's turn and look at the IDEA. The IDEA says a child with a disability is a child who needs special education and related services due to one of these 13 classifications. The law uses the word classification. I would use the word category if I were speaking more generally. These are the classifications that appear on IEPs. I will say that students with dyslexia have come to me with being classified as speech or language impairment, other health impaired. Specific learning disability is the doorway, is the appropriate doorway that we should be going through if we have a child with dyslexia. So let's go through that doorway and see whether we can get any closer to a definition of dyslexia. So the IDEA's definition of specific learning disability is rather a mouthful. The important part is that it includes such conditions as dyslexia. So a disorder, one or more of the basic psychological processes involved in understanding or using language, spoken or written, may manifest itself in the imperfect ability to listen, think, speak, read, write, spell, or do mathematical calculations. The law actually says specific learning disability includes such conditions as dyslexia, and then it stops. There's no definition of dyslexia here. So despite the fact that Section 504 and the IDEA are the main laws that we're using to advocate for students with dyslexia, there is no definition of dyslexia here. Now what? Let's go back and just look at federal law for a moment. We tend to think of federal law as an umbrella. It covers everybody in the country, and it does. However, today I would like for you to think about federal law as a floor. It is the minimum below which states cannot go. So where federal law is silent, or where there's a gap, or where it allows for states to have some independence, states can go above and beyond what federal law requires, but they may not go below. And that's important in the question of the definition of dyslexia, because here in New Jersey has adopted the definition of dyslexia from an organization called the International Dyslexia Association. And several states have done this. They have taken verbatim that definition and made it their own. I'm going to go quickly through the definition, and then I'm going to talk about what the definition means. So this is New Jersey's definition of dyslexia. So as we saw with the Shaywitz research, dyslexia is a specific learning disability that is neurobiological in origin. It is not about vision. It is not about socioeconomic disadvantage. It is not about motor difficulties. It is neurobiological in origin. And it's characterized by difficulties with word recognition, with spelling, and with decoding. We'll talk a little bit about decoding later, but decoding is the process by which students apply letter sound associations to break down a word. A says A, and C says K, and D says D, and breaking down into those small elements of language in order to figure out the word. Continuing the definition, these difficulties result from a deficit in the phonological component of language. Phonemes are the smallest sound units in language. Phonology encompasses that, and also things like rhyme and syllable. That's the world we're in, and there's a deficit there for students with dyslexia. And that deficit is often unexpected in relation to the child's overall cognitive abilities and the fact that they've been in a classroom and have been offered reading instruction. Last part of the definition, secondary consequences can include problems with reading comprehension, understanding what they're reading. Uh-oh. Sorry. My apologies. With understanding what they're reading, and also with gathering basic language and knowledge skills. So if you are supposed to be learning language in order to read a text, and if that text is supposed to be enriching your curricular content, if you cannot read it, then you are also going to be missing that background knowledge. And again, my apologies for the tech glitch here. Here we go. Okay. So this definition, as much as it is very language rich, let's summarize it. So dyslexia is not about intelligence. It's not about vision, which is sometimes a misconception, and it's not about inadequate classroom teaching. Dyslexia does not result from classroom teaching that was not sufficient. Dyslexia is neurobiological in origin. It's about how the brain processes the structural and phonological elements of the English language. And because of this, children with dyslexia, as the definition suggested, typically have difficulty with letter sound associations. A says A, B says B. This makes spelling, recognizing words, and for those of you who are Orton Gillingham practitioners, please don't come after me. We no longer use the term sounding out. I'm referring to it here because I am from the generation where that term means something. It makes spelling, recognizing words, and we would say decoding words challenging. When learning to read, which is what students are doing in the lower grades, when learning to read changes and the students are expected to be proficient in reading so that they can read to learn the curricular content. For those students who have not yet mastered learning to read, comprehension and the general knowledge that they should be taking in from what they're reading can really be impacted. So we've looked at the teaching definition of dyslexia from the Orton Gillingham Academy. We've looked at very briefly why those difficulties are happening, and we've looked into the legal definition of dyslexia and what we need to use here in New Jersey. I realize that is such a quick overview, and again, we are going to touch on each of these 4 topics in hopes of giving you an overview. There is much more to be said about the many types and kinds of dyslexia and how they manifest. But for the moment, I hope you will take that in as an overview. Let's imagine that we're thinking of a particular child and we're listening to these definitions and thinking that really, really sounds like the child I have in mind. I'm going to choose to have that child evaluated. It would be a whole separate presentation to talk about the nuts and bolts of exactly how to request evaluation with the school district. For today, we're going to focus on what happens when you have requested that evaluation. What evaluations will your child likely have? And what should you be looking for in the pile of paper that you get as the report to see whether the child in front of you may indeed have dyslexia? So let's look into evaluations. There is no one evaluation for dyslexia. Because we do not put children in fMRI machines and test their brains to evaluate them for school, there are many, many, many different pieces of tests that we use to see where a child's strengths and deficits may be. Phonemic awareness, rapid automatic naming, receptive and expressive language skills, fluency. These are just some of the evaluations that your child may go through if you suspect dyslexia. Quick note, New Jersey law, recent New Jersey law does have dyslexia screenings. In theory, all students in K through 3 should be screened, and for those with dyslexia indicators, no later than the first semester of second grade for more intensive screenings. Our experience has been that this is not consistently happening. We'd be interested to know from those of you who have children in the schools if it's happening. I just wanted to differentiate the evaluations that your child, the formal evaluations that your child may undergo in order to test for dyslexia, and the New Jersey law and these dyslexia screenings. When you are reading the evaluation of a child with potential dyslexia, you're going to be looking for really 3 kind of separate categories of things. So you're going to be looking for language like phonemic awareness, phonological awareness, decoding. Again, this planet in the blue column is really about letter sound associations. It's about understanding syllables. It's about understanding, being able to be aware of rhyme. Fluency and comprehension. Fluency is generally understood as the ability to read steadily and accurately at a steady pace, to read with expression, fluency. And comprehension, understanding what you're reading. Working memory and processing speed, both of these can actually really factor in for a child with dyslexia. And again, there's much more to be said about each and every one of these terms. But in general, I just want you to have a picture of what you might be looking for as you read through these evaluations. Again, there is no one definitive test for dyslexia. Please note, the results of your child's evaluation may not say dyslexia, and they often don't. They may say specific learning disability with impairment in reading. Sometimes evaluators are going off the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual definition and using that language. Sometimes it will say deficits consistent with a language-based learning disability. Again, both of those can indicate dyslexia. We hear from many, many people. School districts may refuse to use the term dyslexia. The United States Department of Education some years ago published a white paper saying school districts may, can, and should use the term dyslexia. Some of them still refuse to do it. It is an issue and a problem. Quick important note, you do not have to wait in RTI in order to request a dyslexia evaluation. In other words, sometimes school districts may say, well, your student is in RTI. We really need to wait and see how that goes. I understand you want an evaluation, but we're not going to do it right now. We need to wait for RTI. You do not need to wait for RTI. You may request an evaluation for your child if you suspect your child has a learning disability. RTI can continue, but you don't have to wait to request the evaluation, even if your child's in RTI. And again, the United States Department of Education, in one of their white papers, also said this specifically to clarify. Okay, again, very, very brief touch into evaluations. We're going to move on to how to advocate for dyslexia services. So you suspect the child may have dyslexia based on the definitions that we just read. The child is evaluated. You now have evaluations in front of you. You have found some of these words that I have mentioned: phonological awareness, fluency, working memory. You see those in the evaluations, and the evaluations suggest the child may have dyslexia. Now what? So how do children with dyslexia receive services through the school district? We're going to return to our federal law slide, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act and Section 504. These are the two main pathways for students with dyslexia to receive services under the law. So Section 504, we looked at before. IDEA is where you find IEPs. We're going to start with Section 504. It's going to be a relatively short and sweet discussion, simply because most of our students with dyslexia are served under the IDEA. And we're going to see why in a moment. Excuse me. Section 504, short and sweet. Section 504 is actually a civil rights law. It protects individuals with disabilities from discrimination because of their disabilities. Important to note, Section 504 actually applies to a lot of federal entities. It's not only for schools. It applies to entities that receive federal funding. And since every public school district receives federal funding, every public school district is subject to Section 504. That means there is no such thing as a school district that says, well, we don't really do Section 504 here. That's not legal. They do Section 504, and they must, because they receive federal funding. So keep your ear open for that. Sometimes it happens. Here's the situation with Section 504. Section 504 is really about access to education. It's not about methodology. It's not about curricular content. It's really about everybody being able to access the education that's being offered. Some of these accommodations can be very, very helpful. Separate testing space, audio books, directions read aloud, color coding, all of those can be very, very helpful. But none of them by themselves are going to teach students with dyslexia to read. And that's the main reason why our students are generally not served through Section 504 plans. Sometimes we use Section 504, for example, if we have a very, very young child whose difficulties are still emerging, their testing, their evaluations don't clearly show dyslexia, but the student, it would be appropriate for the student to have some accommodations in the classroom. Sometimes this is where we start. But most often, our students with dyslexia are served under the IDEA. And note that those accommodations under Section 504 can appear in a child's IEP under the IDEA. It's not exclusively one or the other, but because the IDEA offers more in terms of curricular content, methodology, as we'll see in a moment, this is where most of our students are served. So unlike Section 504, which is a civil rights law about access, the IDEA is actually a funding statute. It's about funneling federal funds to school districts to help support services for students with disabilities. And again, to be covered under the IDEA, students must fit into one of those 13 classifications or categories. Again, specific learning disability is the appropriate category for students with dyslexia. We have seen kids come through with speech language, OHI. Sometimes we have to argue for a reclassification of a child with dyslexia. But specific learning disability is the appropriate category. The IDEA is where we find IEPs. An IEP is really a contract. It's actually a contract between the school district and the family and the parents or guardians as to what the school district is going to offer to the child. The main reason that students with dyslexia are served under the IDEA is because here students can get, for example, a special classroom setting, ICR, sometimes over the river in New York City, known as ICT, extended school year services, placement in a private school setting, whole other topic that could be a whole other presentation. But here, multisensory research-based approach to reading instruction. This is where students with dyslexia can get the kind of literacy services that are appropriate for them to be able to progress and to learn to read. So this is why students with dyslexia are primarily served under the IDEA. And again, all of those accommodations that were listed under Section 504, they can appear on a child's IEP, but we need the IDEA to be able to get this kind of methodology and curricular content. So let's dive in. Many of you will have heard of the term FAPE, F-A-P-E, free, appropriate public education. The IDEA is the law where we find free, appropriate public education. The IDEA entitles a child with a disability to a free, appropriate public education that's offered in something called the least restrictive environment. We're just going to look at FAPE for the moment. And the main word that we need all the time as attorneys is the word appropriate. This is the hub around which everything orbits. Appropriate. What is an appropriate public education? What does that mean? An appropriate public education, according to the law, meets the unique needs of the child with a disability, prepares that child for future education, employment, and independent living, and enables that child to make progress. That is the definition under the law of what an appropriate education is. So let's take that and let's run with that. I always say during my presentations that if you find yourself in an advocacy situation, you are in an IEP meeting, you are a parent advocate, you are advocating for your own child, you are going to do your best to undergo a vocabulary shift. I am a parent, I was a teacher. What I want with all my heart and soul is to be able to argue for the best education for the child before me, for the education that maximizes that child's potential. And the heartbreak of my job is that the law does not allow me to argue for either one. I can only argue for an education that is appropriate. That's a different standard. An appropriate education. An appropriate education means it meets the child's unique needs, prepares them for future education, employment, and independent living, and allows them to make progress. When you go into an IEP meeting, instead of arguing for what would be best for your child, instead of arguing for what would maximize your child's potential, because remember, in an IEP meeting, we're in the world of the law. You are going to channel your passion and your love and your advocacy into these words: appropriate, unique needs, future education, employment, independent living, make progress. So when you are getting ready to enter into an advocacy environment, I hope that you will consciously change your language over to these words, because these are the words of the law. These are the words that carry weight in those circumstances. So let's unpack that. What are the unique needs of a student with dyslexia? If an appropriate education meets a student's unique needs, what are the unique needs of a student with dyslexia? Every single child is different, and every single child will have needs that are a little bit different. But in general, we've already covered some of the unique needs of a student with dyslexia: deficits in phonology, deficits in word recognition, poor spelling, difficulty decoding. We've also covered that this is a neurobiological difference. So what are the unique needs of a student with dyslexia due to these differences? And we're going to go into these in much more detail. Structured, sequential, multisensory, explicit teaching of letter sound associations. We're going to get there. Consistent error correction and consistent assessment within the structured, sequential, multisensory framework, and consistent strategies for comprehension and fluency. This slide gives the picture of what the unique needs are of a student with dyslexia. And as lawyers, this is some of where we begin to advocate for a student with dyslexia. What are their unique needs? And we start broad basis with some of these.
Hey, Linda.
Hi, Aileen Bafer is calling regarding DVRS.
Yeah, can I call her back? I'm sorry, I'm still on the Zoom.
Thank you. Now that we've addressed unique needs, let's move on to future education, employment, and independent living. Well, what prepares a student with dyslexia for future education, future employment, and to be able to live independently? And I feel the answer to that is functional literacy. Being able to move through the world with literacy that is functional. And I argue for this very, very often. What supports and services will allow a child with dyslexia to make progress up to the point of functional literacy? And that would be a literacy program tailored to those unique neurological processing patterns often seen with students with dyslexia. I want to make a quick note about IEPs because this is relatively new under the law. IEPs must be reasonably calculated to enable a child to make progress that is appropriate in light of the child's circumstances. What does that mean? It used to be that any progress, even if it was kind of minimal or just a little bit more than trivial, was enough. That's all IEPs had to do. Now IEPs have to look at the child's whole circumstances. So where we have a child, for example, who is cognitively very, very bright and has dyslexia, the progress that that very, very bright child is capable of making is much more than 3 new words a year. And so we do look at this in terms of speaking with school districts and speaking about IEPs, because now we must look at the child's whole circumstances and say, just because there was a teeny tiny little bit of progress, that's no longer sufficient under the law. Let's return. Remember, there were 2 things that the IDEA offers: a free, appropriate public education, and that free, appropriate public education must be offered in something called the least restrictive environment. Sometimes we hear LRE, least restrictive environment. Let's take a peek at that. Okay, least restrictive environment. This is the proposition that children with disabilities must be educated with children who are not disabled to the maximum extent appropriate. This is where the term mainstreaming would come in. So special classes, separate schooling, other removal of children with disabilities from the regular educational environment should happen only when it absolutely has to. This is a little bit in reaction to the earlier, very, very early, like late 1960s, early 1970s version of the law, which effectively opened the doors to the schoolhouse, so to speak, but didn't really guarantee children with disabilities anything once inside. Sometimes they were just simply all in one room. So this is a little bit of a social reaction to that. This becomes important where students with dyslexia, sometimes when a district will say, we have a classroom of students who are all having difficulty learning to read. And that classroom in general includes students who have intellectual or cognitive disabilities and are struggling to learn to read because of those. If you have a child who has no cognitive disabilities and is very bright and has dyslexia, sometimes school districts will try to place that child with dyslexia into the classroom of students with cognitive intellectual disabilities to say, well, they all have difficulty learning to read, so this is the right place for your child with dyslexia. But it is too restrictive. This very, very bright child with dyslexia that I'm imagining does not need promotion criteria modified, does not need curricular content modified. So those modifications that are happening in this classroom that already exists, they're too restrictive. They would hold this child back. So the least restrictive environment is the place where all children with disabilities are entitled to. This is my favorite slide. And when we're live and I'm teaching, I often ask for volunteers to try and walk through this after I've done it. So I'm going to go through it so you can hear how each of these individual puzzle pieces come together for us as attorneys when we are advocating for students with dyslexia. So I live as an attorney, I live in that red box. So I can't argue for the education that would be best for the child because that's not the legal standard. I can't argue for the education that will maximize the child's potential because that's not the legal standard. I must live inside the red box and use only the puzzle pieces given to me by the law. Let's hear how it sounds. Dyslexia is a specific learning disability under the IDEA. As such, a child with dyslexia is entitled to a free, appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. An appropriate education is one that meets the child's unique needs, prepares them for education, employment, and independent living, and allows that child to make progress appropriate in light of the child's circumstances. That's how all these pieces fit together when we advocate. I'm going to go back and quickly, I'm going to do that again, but very, very specific. I'm going to imagine a scenario, and I'm going to make it very specific to an imaginary student with dyslexia that I have in my mind. This student has dyslexia. Dyslexia is a specific learning disability under the IDEA. As such, this student is entitled to a free, appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. The classroom in which this child has been offered a placement is not appropriate because it is too restrictive for the child. The classroom includes curricular content that has been modified and modified promotional criteria. This student has a very high FSIQ, general ability index. This is a very cognitively capable child. And so these modifications in this classroom are too restrictive for this child. In addition, an appropriate public education for this child with dyslexia would meet this child's unique needs, which include a unique neurobiological processing profile that includes difficulties with phonology, with phonemic awareness, with decoding, with processing speed, fluency, working memory. The whole language program offered by the district will not prepare this child for future education, employment, and independent living because it does not meet this child's unique needs. And in fact, it may very well leave this child without functional literacy. And as such, it will not allow this child to make progress that's appropriate in light of this very bright, cognitively capable child's circumstances. That's what it sounds like when we advocate for a student with dyslexia using all these puzzle pieces that we've just covered. Okay, we are most of the way down our roadmap here. And the final piece that I'd like to cover, shifting gears a little bit, is Orton Gillingham. So we've looked at a child who we think may have dyslexia based on the definitions that we heard. The child has been evaluated. We've received those evaluations. We've looked for our keywords that may suggest dyslexia. We have gone to an IEP meeting. Here we are advocating for the child using those advocacy terms that we have just gone over. And so many parents say to me, I understand all that, but I don't know what I should be asking for. I know my child needs a very particular type of literacy program, but I don't know what Orton Gillingham is. What am I asking for? What is it? And how do I know whether what's being offered is actually it? And those are great questions. And I have had even respectable attorneys ask me, what is Orton Gillingham? I want to make sure I'm advocating for the right thing. And I love when lawyers ask me that because it means they are so open to really learning and being educated about dyslexia. So let's take a look and see. What is Orton Gillingham? What is it? I'm going to read to you the Academy's definition, and then we're going to dive in and really understand what it is. So the Orton-Gillingham approach is a direct, explicit, multisensory, structured, sequential, diagnostic, and prescriptive way to teach literacy when reading, writing, and spelling does not come easily to individuals, such as those with dyslexia. Orton-Gillingham can be used by anybody, but specifically, it is appropriate for students with dyslexia. This is a lot of words on a page. What I'd like to do is describe to you what Orton-Gillingham is. Let's imagine the entire English language. Let's imagine I'm holding it in my hands. This is the entire English language right here in my hands. And I'm trying to decide, how am I going to teach this whole English language to somebody who cannot intuitively grasp the patterns and the rules and the exceptions of the language? Orton-Gillingham is a theoretical approach to teaching literacy. It's an approach to the English language. That's what it is. It doesn't come in a box. It doesn't have a teacher handbook. There are programs based on this approach, and we'll get to those in a moment. There are programs based on this approach, but Orton-Gillingham itself is an idea. It's a theory. It's an approach. It's a way of looking at the English language and all of its rules. Orton-Gillingham breaks down English into all the individual rules of the language. And imagine that. Imagine how many individual rules the English language has. Wow. And all of the exceptions. And it teaches its trainees, individuals who are going to be Orton-Gillingham teachers or tutors, teaches them how to teach each individual rule and exception, one by one, by one, by one, with the child mastering each step before they move on, building and building and building and building and building until that child has all of the rules and all of the exceptions to apply to any text that they come across. I'm actually going to do what I have never really seen done in a legal presentation. I'm going to show you an example of what Orton-Gillingham is. So when parents say, well, but what are they going to do with my child? Once my child gets into this Orton-Gillingham teaching or tutoring, what are they doing with my child? And it's a great question. This is not something that you have to know or memorize. I'd just like you to see an example. So most of us in kindergarten, we learned about short vowels and long vowels. Long vowels say their name, O, like open. Short vowels are ah, like octopus. So O has two sounds, short vowel and long vowel. What I didn't know as a kindergartner or a first grader growing up in my generation was that the English language has 7 main types of syllables. 7 main types of syllables. We're going to talk about 2 of those kinds of syllables, and we're going to see how knowing syllable types and the rules that go with them can help a student with dyslexia decipher a word. So closed syllables have 1 vowel followed by a consonant. That consonant closes in that vowel. Open syllables end in a vowel. They're not closed in by a consonant. Let's look at this word that I have on the page right there. I'm imagining that I'm a student with dyslexia, and I'm not sure how to pronounce that. Is it note or is it not? I'm not sure. I'm a student with dyslexia, and I'm not sure. I see that there's a T at the end. There's 1 vowel and there's a T. It's closing in that. Oh, that sure looks like a closed syllable to me. And here's my rule. In closed syllables, the vowel is short. That O like octopus, ah. That little sign there is called a brev. And students with dyslexia, you may see them making these markings on their page. When I look at that word, I know closed syllable, vowel is short, not. Okay. I have correctly pronounced the word. But let's take away that T. Let's take away that syllable. Now, that syllable ends in a vowel. Nothing to close it in, no consonant to close it in. It's open. It's an open syllable. In open syllables, the vowel is long. automaton, long. And so as a student with dyslexia, I can apply that rule, and I see that the word has a long O. O says its name, no. And that's how Orton Gillingham works. That is just one tiny example and rule for how Orton Gillingham can help a student with dyslexia decipher, decode, correctly read, pronounce a word on the page, even if they do not remember the word every time they see it. They can apply these rules and they will work. Also works for two-syllable words. There's a consonant closing in the A. The A is short, says ah, like apple. Consonant closing in the E, closed syllable, the vowel is short. Like egg. Mag, net, magnet. Also works when there are two different syllable types in one word. There's the O, nothing's closing it in. O, long O. That E looks like that N is closing it in, closed syllable, the vowel is short. N, open. Those who are Orton Gillingham fellows, who are certified in Wilson, there is much, 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 much more to Orton Gillingham than what I have just lightly shown on the page. I just wanted you to see an example of what it really is. What is Orton Gillingham? The Academy of Orton Gillingham Practitioners and Educators, now known as Orton Gillingham Academy, they are, to my knowledge, the main organization that teaches Orton Gillingham still as a theory, as an approach, and I have been through their training. This is not in a package, it's not in a box. You do sit down and learn the entire English language and all of the rules and all of the exceptions, and you do learn how to reteach them back. It is an enormous, enormous amount of training. There are other programs listed below. For example, and there are many, but for example, Spire, Wilson, the Fairleigh Dickinson Language Toolkit, that take these principles of Orton Gillingham and they make it a little bit more accessible to use in schools. The teachers still need extensive training, but they do come with some materials that can be used for consistency. Please note, Orton Gillingham is not a whole language approach. It is not balanced literacy. It is also not Fountas and Pinnell. It is also not a Lexile score. Those are not related to dyslexia measures. Because of what Orton Gillingham is, because it is intensive and you must understand all of the rules and all of the exceptions and how to teach them back, Orton Gillingham, whoever is teaching your child OG, Orton Gillingham, they must be fully certified. Many Orton Gillingham practitioners, including Wilson, including the Orton Gillingham Academy, go through intensive classroom work to learn all of these rules. And then they have to do a practicum. They are observed by a senior teaching fellow, and they must apply to actually be certified. And if their work is not of appropriate quality, they will be denied certification. That's very different than somebody who's had a 3-day or 2-week training and simply received a piece of paper, a certificate at the end for attending. So as an attorney advocating for children with dyslexia, I always encourage parents to ask, what program will my child be using? And what are the qualifications of the teacher who's teaching it? Are they certified in Wilson? Are they an Academy Fellow or an Academy Associate? What is the qualification of the teacher? Because it is truly necessary for the teacher to be fully certified. When we talk about a program being delivered with fidelity, that means that the Orton Gillingham program has to be delivered in the way it was designed. For example, Wilson has a very clear structure, 5 days a week, X number of minutes per day. That's how you get through a certain number of lesson blocks. And there are lesson plans that the teacher follows every time. There are lesson patterns every time and specific ways of error correction. If the program is not delivered with fidelity, then it's not appropriate for the child. The child is not getting what they need, what's appropriate for them. And any one of these literacy programs include regular assessments. I encourage parents always ask about the assessments. Sometimes they're not being done, and they should be. Always ask if the child is being regularly assessed in whatever supposedly Orton Gillingham-based reading program is being offered. Couple of final notes. It is so, so, so important to me to share this education with everybody, to share an understanding of dyslexia, of Orton Gillingham, because especially as an attorney, I could go in and advocate for a student who could get a reading program that seems to be great on the surface, but if it's not actually what's appropriate for the child, then we may have won the case and this is great and the student's going to get tutoring, but we may have lost that child if that tutoring program, if that reading program is not appropriate for the child, then they're not going to learn to read. And that's where we lose kids. So I am so, so, so glad that you have all come here today. I see many questions in the chat, and I am going to look to Denise to see how much time we have and what questions that she or I may be able to quickly answer.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Alexis. I think we can open this up to questions if people want to raise their hand. Let me just see.
I see many questions in the
Yeah,
chat. I'm not able to see the questions at the moment.
So questions about what to do if the teacher is not certified, and how to proceed. You know, it's hard to give like a one-off answer for those things. Sometimes it's a matter of, you know, looking at the progress and seeing if there's not good progress, then, you know, one of the reasons could be because obviously the teacher is not certified, and asking them to either find a certified teacher or send the child to another school if, you know, if they don't have the proper appropriate environment. I do want to mention, because we have Greg Williams here from the Winston School, which is really a wonderful school located in Short Hills, New Jersey, for students that have dyslexia. Sometimes the school districts agree that the child needs a smaller environment. Maybe this child also has ADHD, attentional issues, and they need this intensive instruction. And they're trying to say the child shouldn't be in the main classroom. They're not learning there. They should be in this resource class. And like Alexis brought up earlier, that the most, I'm not going to say all, because there's like 200 plus districts in New Jersey. So there are some districts in New Jersey that may have small classrooms for kids with dyslexia with the general education curriculum. But as Alexis said, these are bright kids that don't need replacement curriculum. And often, if you'll see on your IEPs or what they're offering, this resource says resource replacement. Replacement meaning that they're not exposing your child to the gen ed curriculum. And so if they're saying that the child needs a small environment because of all these other issues, then they really, the least restrictive placement for that child really is a school like the Winston School, and not a resource classroom. They'll be saying, well, the resource classrooms in this you know, in their local public school, that's least restrictive. But that child would be taken out of the general education curriculum if they were in that smaller environment that everyone agrees they need. And at the Winston School, they would not. The Winston School goes to 8th grade. And to my knowledge, pretty much every kid who graduates in 8th grade goes to, you know, access general education curriculum in high school. And so, you know, when the districts talk about least restrictive to you for a child with dyslexia, they often bring it up as least restrictive is the same as saying public school. But for these kids with dyslexia, least restrictive could be the Winston School or a school like the Winston School, because that's where the child's needs can be met, where they have access to the curriculum that they can access because of their cognitive abilities allow them to access that curriculum. So, you know, I think that's one thing that you want to think through. But, you know, back to the question, if they're not providing appropriate programming, the first thing is, you know, let's say the child is in all other respects doing fine in the public school, but they're not getting the right reading instruction. Well, then, going back and saying the child's not making meaningful progress. And again, if your child is a year behind when they've caught the dyslexia, meaningful progress has got to be more than a year for every year, right? Because if the child, sometimes they'll say, well, your child did make progress. They went from here to here, and that's 6 months progress. Well, now your kid is a year and a half behind the other kids. So that's not meaningful progress, especially for these kids with dyslexia who have, you know, average to above average IQ. So if given an appropriate program, those students can make up ground or close the gap, as it's sometimes discussed in when we talk about dyslexia. Let's see, here's another one for you, Alexis. What are good assessments to follow? Oh, sorry, just jumped. To make sure there is actual progress. My school has historically used iReady, which is, I know, not great, but recently let him use his accommodations to text to speech, so he showed a huge jump.
I usually say that the first thing we need to do is look at the program that's being offered to the child, looking at the literacy program. The first question is always, is the program appropriate for the child? And the second question is, okay, if so, what are the assessments that are actually built into that program? And if the answer is there are no assessments built into this program, then that's a serious issue, because we need to see whether the student is making progress. It's really at the center of everything that we do. It's hard to answer without knowing exactly who the child is and what program is being offered. But for example, the Wilson program has regular assessments. Fellows from the Orton Gillingham Academy, or those who are certified through them, they will also do regular assessments. So it depends, first of all, what is the program being offered? Is it appropriate for the child? And if it is, are there assessments built in? Because the answer is normally, or should be, yes, there are. And as a parent, I encourage parents and guardians to request the assessments. If you're not sure whether the school is assessing your child or whether the program has assessments, you are entitled to ask, could I see the assessments that you've done for my child's reading? Could you send those to me? You are entitled to get those, and I encourage you to do so.
I would also add that the educational evaluations that the districts do as part of their triennial every 3 years, those assessments can be done more often. They can't be done within a year, but they can be done after a year. And if you feel that your child's not making meaningful progress, you can ask them to do another educational eval, or even just to do the reading portion of the educational eval, the same one that they did the time before. So you have a baseline and you see, and those scores have standardized scores, right? So the child maybe made some, progress, but the standardized score is going down because they actually are losing ground, because they're comparing them to their peers for those standardized scores. So, this argument about how much training is a tough one, because like I'm talking about legally, not like Alexis is right. Like, of course, in order to have the right program, you need the right training. Okay. But the districts will often say, well, this one is trained, it's enough, it's this, you need to have in your parent comment section of your IEP, and very clearly stated, even in emails to the district, that you have a lot of concern that they're not providing the appropriately trained instructor, and as such, your child's not going to make meaningful progress. And then, because the thing is, if you file right away on that, it's very hard, for judges to sort of parse through what training is enough or not enough legally. Okay, legally, not talking about, again, what should be provided. However, if you've made clear that you, as a part of the IEP team, which you are, have concerns that the program they're providing or the teacher providing the program or both are not appropriate, you have to make that very clear. And then you follow up with, an assessment a year later to see what the progress is. And look, is it possible that someone is going, that the child has mild dyslexia and that the teacher doesn't have the best training, but they connect with the child and they're just a superstar. I mean, there are, like we all know, there are some teachers, and also the relationship. This is really hard work for the kids. It's like really hard for them. And when they have a teacher that they trust and they feel comfortable with and happy with, it can, can they make the progress? It's possible. The other thing that we often recommend, if you can afford to do it, is if you have your own private teacher coming, say, once a week, that is collaborating with the in-school teacher that isn't employed by the school district, okay? That's your own person who can tell you, like, hey, your child's getting this instruction, 5 days a week at school, but every week I come and it doesn't seem like they're learning anything, and I have a lot of concerns. And they're an expert too now. So you have this built-in expert that's working with your child that can, reach out to the teacher and ask questions and ask the right questions about what they're doing. And, sometimes they push the kid ahead before they really have, this is, oh, they didn't want the child to feel bad. So they went ahead, even though the child didn't have, the skills that they needed to, appropriately move to the next step. That's a problem because that's not how you're supposed to teach them. And then there are holes in the learning and they don't learn appropriately. But that person at home can sort of raise the red flags, and you can ask for an IEP meeting. They can put something in writing that they have these concerns, and so that you don't have to wait for a whole year to get the testing. So that's just another avenue. Oh. Yeah, so this person is saying they've been told that Fontes and Pinnell and Runny records are showing progress. When approaching the conversation, these are not valid measures for a child with dyslexia or aligned to a program. They'll say that's what they use and what's provided to the teachers in the district. Yes, do you see this? Do you see it's like the last, do you want to take that one?
Yes. This is often where parents begin. This is often where parents end up approaching us to say, look, they keep telling us that Fontes and Pinnell and Lexile score. They keep telling me this is progress, but it doesn't, it really shouldn't be. And this is where I generally say, if you are very, very concerned about your child's reading progress, the child needs an evaluation, because what you really need is something else in your pocket, an evaluation that says this child needs a multisensory research-based program, literacy program, in order to make progress. Sometimes, and it shouldn't be this way, but sometimes as parents, as guardians, you're pushing up against the district that just gives you the wall and says, sorry, this shows progress. We don't have to follow the, dyslexia handbook. It's just guidance. If you are really concerned about your child's reading progress, I encourage you to have your child formally evaluated so that you have something to go in with to say, no, Fontes and Pinnell is not a multisensory research-based literacy program. And this is what the evaluation says my child needs for an appropriate education. It is so hard. And that's kind of the point where sometimes parents start approaching advocates and attorneys to say, they keep telling me this, and yet I know that my child can't read, even if they're moving up the F&P levels. I know they can't read. What do I do now? What next?
Those things too, even if they're not using Fontes and Pinnell as the reading instruction, when they use that as the way to see if the child is making progress, for kids with dyslexia, it just doesn't work, because
It's not appropriate.
also about, well, first of all, at the lower levels, it doesn't penalize and lets them go up even if they don't have the fluency. That stops, but still they're like, wait, and a lot of times with those little books, the kids with dyslexia have memorized a whole bunch of words, and it looks like they're reading, and they're, so, and it's also about comprehension, which again, most of these kids don't have a problem comprehending if they can read it or if they hear the story, right? So it's just like using a measure to measure not all the right things or the wrong things or the things that the child doesn't have a disability in, or something that has been able to be masked over because of, at the beginning, like we all know that THE is the, right? That's a red word, right? A sight word. We know it's not the. We're not reading it that way. There are kids with dyslexia who end up memorizing a lot of words. And at the beginning, it can seem like they're reading, especially if it's the same books that, they've used over and over. So, it's really important to have the right evaluations. If you can afford to hire your own expert to evaluate the child, to observe what's happening in the school district, to look at the program and the progress and all of that, and then write a report for, again, there's different ways that we come at these cases because honestly, they really all are different. So there are times where someone comes to us, they have even triennial evaluations from the district, and they've just gotten this 3-year educational, and the child has fallen off the map. And they're just like, wait a second, my kid was in all of this reading instruction, and they told me they were getting this, and now it's 3 years, which is a crazy amount of time, and you don't necessarily need a private evaluator to tell you that what they're doing at the school is not working for the child. But that's like a 3-year thing. And by the way, a lot of times, like I said, these kids can look like they're reading, and the parents are involved and there and reading with the child, and it seems like they're reading, but they've maybe read that book 5 times, have an amazing memory, and have memorized it, and it looks like they're reading, and they're not reading. So please don't think that we're at all saying like the parents that are shocked, they're involved parents, but they just, it didn't, they're not the teachers, they're not there, and they're just seeing whatever they're seeing. There are also kids that don't like to read so much at home, and so their parents are trusting what the district is saying. So, getting your own evaluator is another really excellent way, again, if you can afford it, to have an outside person who's expert in this area look at the child and the programming and everything, and then opine as to whether it is or isn't appropriate. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the child can't be served in the district and has to go somewhere else. Like sometimes it says, okay, yeah, actually the teacher is good and certified, but the child's only getting this every other day, or they're getting it in a group for 30 minutes a day, and that's not intensive enough, and so they need it more. So it's
or it's not flowing through their school day. So they're getting, for example, Orton Gillingham, they're getting it during their ELA or reading period, and then they go to math class and they can't read the word problem because the strategies that are being used in their Orton Gillingham reading program are not also being used during math class, are not also being used during science, are not also, and so the child is doing really well in Orton Gillingham during the ELA period, and then goes through the rest of the day and struggles because, again, where that learning to read changes to reading to learn, those Orton Gillingham strategies have to flow through the child's entire day. Or sometimes the child is pulled out for Orton Gillingham and then is back in the classroom for whatever the district's reading program is, and those are 2 completely different theories. And you have a young child who's trying to absorb 2 completely different theories of reading, and that's also not appropriate. That really shouldn't be happening.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you to everyone. We really appreciate you all joining. This presentation will be up on our website in a few days. And as Alexis said, she's happy to take any if something comes up as a question to this after the fact. But thank you all.
Please feel free to email. And also, it's important to us as attorneys that the information that we're sharing is the information that's helpful to you. We welcome you to leave feedback in the chat if there's something we didn't cover that you wish we did, or we covered something that you really thought was helpful. Please let us know. We do this to try and get this information out and to help people. And it's great for us to know where we're hitting the mark and where you would have liked to hear more. So thank you all for coming.
I'll just also add that we're willing and do often speak to parent groups, just to a parent group. So if you have a parent group and you think that the parents would enjoy having, a live presentation as opposed to just watching the video of this presentation, we would be happy to schedule something with that group directly. So, all right, thank you. And oh yeah, we will send the slides out as a PDF to everyone who is on the webinar. So yes, someone just asked that. Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.